Gavan, Reilly, political correspondent with TV3, and Keiran, Shannon of the Irish Examiner are here in studio. So we won't spend forever on this, but because it was touched on last week, certainly the rugby media relationship was touched upon. But several of the Sunday writers are talking about the ongoing decline in relations between media and multiple teams. Jim Gavan, Joe Schmidt. The boxing situation is also mentioned by Eamon Sweeney. So Eamon Sweeney in the Sunday in a Minute back page is talking about it. Shane McGrath, page 74 of the Mail, is talking about the fact this is a control thing. Above all else, it's about managers wanting to exert control. Dennis Walsh, I thought, had a very good piece in the Sunday Times on page 13. Dennis Walsh is largely focused on the Dublin Jim Gavan versus RTE situation.
Yeah, I mean, there was some... Micheál Clifford would have... gone there with the Mail, which I thought it was interesting, where I hadn't seen the line as such, but he said that when Bernard Brogan was unable to participate in the Donegal game last Saturday week, he has a niggle, replied Gavan. You know, he had more, and he just talks about how it would only be exposed for not only being shy of the truth, but barely masked his indifference, contempt, disregard for the press. So I just thought that was an interesting line.
I realised he said that, yeah.
I suppose of the pieces, Eamon Sweeney has a strong enough piece, Shane McGrath too. I particularly like Dennis Walsh's. Like, there was a good bit of journalism in it. You know, he obviously made certain calls, so he would have explained. Over the years, inter-county managers have often lent on the generosity of their Sunday games contacts, and the request for match footage would have been quietly met. For the last 3 championships, however, the Sunday game production team have taken an enlightened approach. Every match they cover is uploaded to a Google Drive, which is made available to any inter-county team who approach them for footage. There is no preferential treatment, and they don't ask for anything in return. What they hope, however, is that their generosity would be reciprocated and some extra interview access would be granted along the way. So
I hadn't realised that.
Yeah. So they put it up on Google Drive, and so if no matter who you are, you can go in and you get access. Because you see, people like misinterpreting maybe earlier in the week, it's more than just getting your opponent, your own footage. It's footage of opponents, and also it could be opponents that are coming well down the line. I mean, Eamon Fitzmaurice famously would have noted that they would have seen that when they went to cover was a Cork Clare Munster semi-final in 2013, that Dublin were at it, you know, at a game like so, and it turned out Dublin ended up playing Cork in the All-Ireland quarter-final. So it's nearly they have eyes everywhere. So now what I have been led to believe that Dublin would have possibly had, through a couple of other contacts there, they would have had people going into RT and getting access that other people wouldn't have had access at a certain point. Like, a big thing for tactically is to get camera angles for the high behind. So, like, I mean, that way you can spot different manoeuvres, kickouts.
You can see all 30 players.
But that's something that RT wouldn't have had, though.
Pardon?
That's something that RT wouldn't have had in
not
this
in the
instance.
National League,
yeah.
But I mean, you're talking about through the years. No, but people would say they were asking for stuff that other people wouldn't have asked for. But they've been RT have tried to put in a system here where it's more equitable.
Yeah.
So, like, just from reading it.
So is your interpretation then that, and you see, this is the thing, because we'll touch on Joe Schmidt in a second. We don't know why exactly Joe Schmidt has cancelled the Monday briefings for the print journalists. We don't know why Jim Gavan is not talking to RTE. Like, we haven't heard it from Gavan himself, so we're operating in a vacuum here.
Although there is, again, sorry to interrupt, but there is one line in Dennis Walsh where he does attribute that the RTE reporter who sought to speak to Jim Gavan was told cooperation is a two-way street, which does suggest that there is truth to the DVD complaint. It
does, but cooperation is a two-way street, could be anything. I mean, it certainly seems like the DVD issue is at the root cause, but Jim Gavan hasn't exactly explained why.
It's a combination of things.
You see, that's why I wonder, like, if Dermot Connolly hadn't blown up last year, would this be such a big deal now? Is that part of the thinking here? But so, sorry, just that's interesting. Your understanding, Keiran, is that Dublin, up until now, had been getting a few extra angles and a few extra types of footage that other counties hadn't been, and maybe now RTE have pulled back on that to make it more equitable across the board, and Dublin presumably aren't best pleased with that? It's not just they're not just looking for a DVD.
It's not in isolation, but it would be another reason where there's been a bit of a pushback. You know, it could be things like even like, if you take it, they won the 3 in a row last year. Like, they didn't win Team of the Year, let's say. They were even those little things add a little bit to the tension. But I think where, as I said, Dennis had, you could see he made the calls. I think he touched on it at the end, with the strongest editorial line on it, which is, will Dublin sponsors be bothered about the current standoff with RT? Probably not yet anyway. But for Dublin to pick a fight on an issue such as this shows poor judgment on their part. They need to get over themselves. Like, a big value of the Dublin setup, and I believe it is one that in generally they've lived by, is humility. Jim Gavan often speaks about it. You often hear them talk about it. This showed this wasn't an act of humility, and it may go against. They've had a media manager. Takes the role very seriously and overall has been quite successful. I mean, they would have felt in previous years hype has hurt Dublin. Dublin would have been disliked. Overall, these players individually have come across as quite likeable.
Yeah, they're great. Yeah.
And I mean, as much as the cliche is to say, oh, they just speak in cliches, I mean, you've had a few of them in
They
here
don't,
through
yeah,
the
it's
years,
not true, they
like
don't.
the Keane O'Sullivans. I've sat down with quite a few of them, Kevin McManam, and they're actually at various times in the year they can be very open.
Yeah.
Philly McMahon's just wrote an inspiring book.
Yeah, Paul Flynn's another.
Yeah, so like you've got to give that has to be acknowledged. So I do think that they often live by humility, but this is a time where I think they've gone. I think this counters, and the other thing, it adds a distraction when they're actually in the game of making sure the media isn't a distraction.
It does make them a story when they wouldn't otherwise be.
Yeah, I think they
but I
maybe
wonder,
haven't thought that through.
Because it has struck me as strange, because initially the point was made that, well, RTE don't have access to the footage because they're not the rights holders for the league.
In fairness, I was one of the people that was pointing that out, and I did notice it get quoted earlier on. And what's helpful actually today is that Dennis Walsh has figured out exactly what game Jim Gavan was purportedly looking for, which is Galway's league game against Tyrone on the very first weekend of the league. That wasn't broadcast live, so RTE had it included in their Sunday night highlights show, but it wasn't carried live by either Ayr or TG Cahir, which does beg the question as to where the footage came from. And it did in fact RTE send a camera along purely for highlights purposes. So in fact maybe all along that RTE may have been the only people who have the full footage that he's been looking for, which in fairness is one point to make.
Yeah, it does all seem, I mean, the headline Dublin sulk over video games, certainly Dennis Walsh doesn't think much of it, and actually he uses two interesting examples. I guess it raises the wider issue of how the media and various teams are going to interact over the coming years, because they're not politicians. We don't owe them. They're not obligated to come out and speak. So
they're
there
not
is
professionals.
no, well, particularly in the GAA case, there's an element of goodwill. Like Joe Schmidt is paid by the IRFU and they have commercial reality, so he has to do the press conference and he has to do broadcast media. But beyond that, he can probably begin to draw a line. But so Dennis mentions some interesting examples. I wasn't aware of this one, where a few years ago Glasgow banned a BBC Scotland reporter from Ibrox Rangers, banned a BBC Scotland reporter from Ibrox because they weren't happy with his reporting of their financial problems, and BBC Scotland in retaliation imposed a boycott on covering Rangers home games and press conferences, and BBC Scotland took the view that the integrity of their journalism must be defended above all else. And Dennis also points out something I hadn't realised. He says eagle eyes in the IRFU will have noticed repeated references to Lansdowne Road in some daily papers this week, as opposed to the sponsor's name by which the stadium is now known. Hadn't realised that was happening. Eamon Sweeney touches on that whole area as well.
He does, and his general point appears to be that he appears to take the opposite position to Keiran beside me, because he says that basically that in short, screw it, that the media can do easily without getting more anodyne, banal quotes from Jim Gavan after a game. That what are we going to miss?
David Meath has weighed in with exactly that point, and it's Eamon Sweeney's overarching point as well. David Meath says the question you should be asking Media Access is, do the sports supporting public actually care? The issue is always viewed through the prism of the media's self-interest. Personally, I've no interest in press conferences and manager interviews. What do we learn from them ever anyway? And that is a fair point. Like Eamon Sweeney makes the point that where you really learn stuff is like the Kimmage with McElroy and Harrington situation, where it's long form and there's probing questions. Jerry Thornley sat down with Joe Schmidt on the first week of the Six Nations and did a big full-on one-on-one interview, which is worth about 38 million press conferences with Joe Schmidt. But Sweeney makes the point that these things aren't particularly good. The post-match interview is never particularly good. And I would say actually, and I wonder, the Joe Schmidt is now not talking to the print dailies on a Monday for that briefing. I have to be honest, I would much rather read in that space, that real estate which is designated on a Monday paper
the Schmidt quote
to
piece.
rugby.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd much rather read a really good piece of analysis.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Which tells me something about the game rather than Schmidt. So actually, I think it's self-defeating. I think Schmidt, in this instance, could control the narrative for a week or certainly for a day or so. Instead, there'll now be a requirement for a piece of analysis or a column from a former player who may point out the failings of Schmidt. But anyway, sorry. That's
on the Mondays. But I do think it is quite interesting afterwards. I still think it's. I mean, a journalist like Eamon now, let's say, wouldn't be. Like, there's a certain freedom as a particular columnist where you're not having to encounter. I often think of the local media guys in particular, by having to go and meet the guy after a game, is compromised in. It's time for someone else to move on, for someone else to get the gig. Yeah. There's that. So I think it's useful to have. Eamon doesn't need to do it, but it's useful because, you know, you'll get a column from something a manager did say. One thing that I think is a waste of time is trying to get a word with the managers, you know, the 20 minutes beforehand. They're in a different space. Yeah. You'll be the journalist.
Except Davy Fitzgerald. They're always commenting.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Davy, and just to go back to the point about whether there's any value in post matches at all. In a previous life for a summer, I worked in the communications unit of the GAA, and I was there on match days, and I got to witness some of the sit downs that the print reporters would do after the manager had done their broadcast obligations, and I'm suddenly aware of the word obligations, which perhaps might not be the fairest word at all. Some of the ones that I witnessed David Fitzgerald do at the time post-match were extraordinarily revealing. That he was still managing Waterford at the time. There was a semi-final where he was absolutely convinced that they had just finally gotten hold of Kilkenny until they didn't, and Kilkenny beat them at the death. And the gut-wrenching heartbreak, the defeat etched on his face, was remarkable, and there was absolutely a value to doing that. There was a value to Brian Cody being asked by Marty Morrissey after the 2009 final, how do you feel, and Cody going off on one because he doesn't feel he's getting the appropriate plaudits that his feat has just deserved. So there is a value too. There's a value in Tony O'Donoghue talking to Martin O'Neill after the playoff and suddenly getting his head eaten off for asking legitimate questions about team selection, which had a very diplomatic response that Martin O'Neill chose not to use. So there is a value to it, but only in instances where the person speaking has any interest in saying something, which Jim Gavan clearly doesn't.
But I still find it. I find it quite telling, even what Gavan is saying. Like, he won't give you.
If you keep banging that table, I'm going to bang you.
I find it interesting when Gavan, even the way that he's not going to offer an anecdote about, let's say, the way Liam Griffin would talk about, or Lucknan would talk about what Davy Fitz did, and then he gets a goal in the last minute. He was practicing those frees. He's not going to offer colour as such. But even the way he talks, like, about, let's say, I thought even, let's say, when the one game they lost, let's say the league final last year, the way that he spoke, like he was saying that he was still happy with how the players had showed resilience. They'd come from, was a 5 down to level it. Like, there are little insights that he's actually giving that, like, you could tell that. Even, I thought, let's say after the Kildare game where he spoke, he basically was saying, you know, we scored 2-10 all from play and we've only been back 2 weeks. Like, the message he's trying to get out there is, we're going for this, or that we're fairly formidable, like, and that we've yet to really only crank up. He's not overly saying it, but there's subtext there, and it'll be interesting. Does he speak to RT? I think, are they in Castlebar next weekend? RT will be covering highlights. I don't know, it'll be Ger Canning, or if Marty's still on the dancing or whatever, but whoever's there. It'll be interesting what happens.
Yeah, you'd wonder how long he can maintain the silence, given the fact that, as Dennis Walsh points out, RTE are going out of their way on Google Drive to actually put up all the games and facilitate these teams as much as possible. Like, that seems fairly fair.
But
to me.
That's championship again.
Sure, but will it extend to the championship? Will he hold the grudge over the league for the full year? I mean, when do you draw the line and say enough is enough?
Well, is there a point? Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
I think the other wider point, because the specifics of Schmidt and Gavan can drag us in. There is the wider point that Eamon Sweeney raises, and Brendan O'Brien did it very eloquently here last Sunday, about the fact that increasingly IRFU TV, or Irish Rugby TV, and FAI TV now see themselves, and this goes across the board, Premier League clubs, Leinster TV, they all see themselves now as being media companies in their own right, and realise they can probably make money in the long term.
Well, who had the exclusive 2 weeks ago when Martin O'Neill finally commented that he'd agreed his contract?
Exactly, and I can show you here. I had written it down. Here's the. So I guess a ton of people listening can say to themselves, "Look, I don't really care this doesn't bother me, this is not a big issue. But if it becomes propaganda, and I was going to use the example of Martin O'Neill. So we saw Martin O'Neill talk about his contract situation on 2 occasions in the last month. The first was on FAI TV, where he did a 2 or 3 minute, and I don't know why these things always look like it's a hostage situation, but he's if they could just think about production values, it's just a personal thing.
Instead of being chained to a radiator,
the lighting and the weird backdrop is just always very strange. Even put a plant in there behind him, or just something, signs of life. It doesn't have to be a bunker. Anyway, so he's being interviewed. 2-3 minutes. Are you happy to sign your contract? I am, Martin. Yeah, you must be delighted. Yeah, no, I'm delighted. And an exciting League of Nations on the way. Yeah, it's going to be very good. End of interview. And not one mention of the fact that he had been the favourite and in discussions with Stoke City. So if newspapers and print and radio and everything is sidelined to a point where it gets no access, and that is the only interview Martin O'Neill might do, that is what you're getting. Now, if you're a fan who says, I only care about watching the games and I don't care about the personalities or what they're like, fine, but I think you're in the minority. I think we love sport because of the personalities. And the second interview O'Neill did was with Tony, which, O'Neill just turned it into a disgrace. All by himself. The questions Tony asked were perfectly fair. But that issue of propaganda, if FAI TV and IRFU TV and Leinster TV and Munster TV are where we're all headed in 30 years, then it will be pretty dull.
Well, this is where we're getting to almost, particularly when it comes to the national teams, and we can park Dublin for a moment, although there's a certain aspect to it as well. Sometimes we treat these national sports teams as if they are somehow an extension of the nation, that it's a formal part of the state, that Martin O'Neill holds public office, that Joe Schmidt holds public office, and then we tend to demand the same responses of them as we would from a president or a Taoiseach or a minister or anyone else. And of course that's absurd, because who does Martin O'Neill answer to other than the FAI executive? But who else does he answer to are perhaps, the people who are paying his wages, which include the people who take out season tickets or who show up on a muggy November night to watch Ireland take on Moldova or Oman in another friendly. That there is a certain responsibility to those people as well. And if we're getting to the point where they only communicate through their own state organs, as you might call them in another era, and there is no sense of being open to scrutiny from the paying public, then will we get to a point where there's such a critical mass of public dismay and sympathy that they actually start voting with their feet and don't going? Now, maybe it's a leap to say that Joe Schmidt or Martin O'Neill's media policy will somehow lead to empty seats and the absence of bums in Lansdowne Road.
See, I don't think it will. I think people will still go.
But might it get to that point?
If
they become so antagonistic, if Martin O'Neill continues the campaign against Tony O'Donoghue, might people go, not paying to see that?
I sort of feel they'll always do the odd sit-down interview here and there, and enough to keep things going, but it will become a lot duller. But I still think the attraction of the games will trump that. You'd
like to hope so, but then do the games become as attractive when the media are handcuffed in how they cover them because of their inability to perform any media?
Not for me. How the media and how they interact with the characters and how characters respond to scrutiny or interesting questions, all of that stuff is part of the whole enjoyment of sport and the circus of it. I might be in the minority.
But the circus of it is the point, because Enda McAvoy has written before, former colleague of yours, Keiran, has written before.
Current,
apologies. Enda has written the point that he doesn't think Ireland is actually a nation of sports junkies at all, but rather we're a nation of event junkies. And part of the reason why there's such hysteria around an All-Ireland final between Dublin and Mayo that could easily sell 200,000 tickets, and yet a league clash between the two might not sell 10, is because of the sense of event. And if the media are constrained in their ability to naturally hype up that sense of event because the stakeholders or the main antagonists won't talk to them, then maybe it will come back to bite them on the financial backside.
Who can say for sure, I suppose. Do you want to have a last word in this and we'll move off it?
Yeah, no, I think we've covered it all.
Okay, grand. Because there's nothing where, people I think don't really care in some respects as well.
It's the media talking about the media, really, isn't it?
It's sort of, it is, but then honestly,
it does give an
watch back the FAI TV with Martin O'Neill. You'll get it on YouTube. And this guy's just been talking to Stoke City. He's potentially left the job.
Has Michael O'Neill been questioned in anything like the same way, like when he was talking to Scotland?
I don't know.
Scotland, I do think a lot of it is because I suppose down here we are more focused on the Republic team rather than the Northern team. But I think part of it is people were hoping Michael O'Neill will return, whereas with Martin, I don't think anybody would have been overly upset if he had moved on. I think that's part of it too.
It felt like the right time.